With political defections and American invasions, there's not much to cheer you up on this bluest of blue Mondays, but we'll do our best. I'm Frank McKenna, and this is the Downtown Den Politics Podcast.
The return of the sausages.
All sorts of things that I would have wanted as a kid that I couldn't have, right? Famously, Sky TV.
How'd that happen? I guess I just forgot what was going on.
They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats.
Yay, it worked.
So a belated Happy New Year to all of our watchers and listeners, and of course to my partners in crime, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips, who held the fort last week. Very interesting podcast it was too. And this week we're going to turn our attentions, first part of our conversation, to domestic matters, and in particular the big story of the week, I suppose, which was Robert Jenrick's defection to Reform. Was this a particular surprise, Joe, or has it been on the cards for some time? Well, clearly it's been planned for some time, but I still think there was an eyebrow or two raised because many people, our own James Hancock included, believe that Jenrick still had more than half an eye on the Conservative Party leadership, and potentially, if those results in May in the local elections are as disappointing as some are predicting for the Tories, he could have challenged Kemi Badenoch then. But no, he's decided to cross the floor and join Nigel Farage's merry army.
Yes, and it's funny, isn't it? There's a great irony because he's probably given Kemi Badenoch the best boost she could have wished for, because she got rid of him before he announced his defection. And she did it coldly, brutally, and very, very deliberately. That was the shock. And he was still apparently denying he'd got any plans to defect until he was then forced into the press conference. It caught Nigel Farage unawares. He was doing a press conference in Scotland at the time, and it was not what they'd planned. And I think, when I heard it and saw it, I thought, well done, Kemi. Good for you. I think it will have done her the power of good. And I think Jenrick, he joins hot on the heels of Nadhim Zahawi, the brief chancellor, but also the vaccine minister at one point, which is interesting that he's gone to Reform, which appear to be anti-vaccine. And now we've got Andrew Rossendale, if anyone's ever heard of him and anyone cares, but apparently he's been an MP for an awfully long time, but has made no mark on the political landscape, and he's gone to Reform. So, Reform is beginning to look even more like a Tory tribute band. It's also very, very male, and it's an awful lot of egos there, and I don't see that there's room for Nigel Farage, Richard Tice, Nadhim Zahawi, Zia Youssef, and particularly Robert Jenrick.
It's an interesting move, Jim, because Jenrick, as I say, could still have potentially put a challenge up against Kemi Badenoch later this year, and many people had been predicting that he would do if those local elections go the way that people are predicting and projecting. He's been doing the interview rounds this morning as Mr. Jenrick, or as I like to call him, Alan Partridge, saying that one of the reasons that he decided to jump ship was because he'd urged Kemi Badenoch to kick Liz Truss out of the party because of her disastrous tenure in 10 Downing Street. Now, that's somewhat of a surprise to me, because I thought Liz Truss would be a prime candidate as a potential Reform recruitee moving forward. So seems to have basically settled that particular argument, because very publicly saying, the one of the big problems for the Conservatives was the fact that they couldn't rid themselves of the Liz Truss 40-odd days in office. It's a bit of a strange statement, I thought, particularly given his own record in government wasn't particularly great. But what did you make of the defection? What did you make of Kemi Badenoch's management of the situation?
Well, that was very good, because she apparently she got the papers and there's a whole backstory about how the papers became available. The one that seems to be most credible is that there was somebody within his office who was disapproved of what he was planning to do and leaked it. But she got the papers apparently on Wednesday night, and instead of reacting immediately, waited until Farage was in a press conference in Scotland. So you've got this great optic of him staring at a mobile phone to find out the news, which is always good. And and getting it out on the airwaves, that he was removed from the shadow cabinet and expelled from the Tory party before he had a chance to do anything. Therefore, they were then scrabbling around. And, again, another optic. I know all these things will disappear and not be remembered, really. But, not coming, when Farage announced, coming into the room is our latest defector. And then there was a 2-minute hiatus. Well, apparently he was revising his notes outside. It was a bit of a shambles. So forcing the thing ahead of time and showing her decisiveness was a good move. I mean, we have to say that he wasn't my cup of tea, but he was an asset to the Tory party in many ways. He's chasing fare dodgers down the tube. He was always keeping in the headlines. But just to sort of I said he could be leader of the Tory party. I mean, that was when Badenoch had a very uncertain start, but of course ever since the autumn, when she's been buttressing her position, his chances of becoming leader in the immediate future, and it's got to be immediate for him because he's an impatient man, were fading. And he's gone over there because he thinks, I think he probably would be misguided, that his way to number 10 Downing Street is to join Reform. When and if Farage goes, there'll be then this almighty tussle and wrestling of egos between Richard Tice and Robert Jenrick for the leadership of Reform. And gosh, if you think about Brown and Blair and people like that, you ain't seen nothing yet, mate. So to me, it's pure ambition. He's making these things up, and the thing you cite this morning is frankly ridiculous for the reasons you state. Saying he's gone because Liz Truss wasn't sacked. It's just incoherent nonsense.
Well, you have him saying that, and then you say the guy from Romford, whose name I've already forgotten, who's just
Andrew
defected.
Rossendale.
He's blaming their approach to the Chagos Islands.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely nonsensical. But I do wonder. I mean, that by the way, Jim, mentioning Blair and Brown in the same breath as Tyson Jenrick, I think
Yes.
No, I'm just watching a documentary series.
A yellow card at least.
Oh, I think that's a red card, actually.
Bloody hell. But nonetheless, I think that if you look at the wider implications of this, and I agree with both of you in terms of the way Kemi Badenoch handled the situation was very good, and I don't think she'll have done herself any harm at all as far as that's concerned. But for those who do watch these things, and we have to remind ourselves that most voters don't give a toss in a sense, but the perception, I think you've hit the nail on the head, Joe, it increasingly starts to look like former failed Tories are going to become the spine of Reform UK, a party that, of course, is trying to sell itself as anti-establishment. We're not like the other lot. And I think the other interesting thing is that when you start to look at defections, not just of MPs, but of councillors and people like Dorries and Jenkinson, and these people, these people who, as I say, have got a track record in government previously that is not exactly anything to shout about. Farage is going to have to be careful. And it's interesting to see that excellent organisation, Best for Britain, have now produced a tracker to show who the Tories who have defected to Reform are. So we'll put that tracker in the show notes, if we may, Francesca, so that people can keep an eye on the number of people who've crossed the floor. The final point I'll make before I bring you back into the conversation, Joe, is that I think Jenrick, both in terms of his performance at the press conference, where he totally trashed all of his colleagues, from Priti Patel to Kemi Badenoch and anybody else who got in the way, basically, and hadn't supported him for his leadership bid, through to this bizarre interview today where he's saying that the reason he left is because Badenoch wouldn't expel Liz Truss, demonstrates an arrogance and a lack of self-awareness that I would suggest will not be attractive to the British electorate, and indeed won't necessarily be attractive to his new Reform colleagues.
No, I agree with you. And I mean, the things that he has said previously about Nigel Farage and Farage has said about him. Now, we know there's an awful lot of mudslinging in politics, and then somebody dies and they go, oh, he was wonderful. We all remember that fantastic Smith and Jones, alias Smith and Jones sketch where one of them keels over having had a huge row and the other one goes, oh, he was wonderful man, gave his all for the country. And I do think it's very difficult. And I think you're absolutely right. I don't think the public like that sort of mudslinging, and I don't think they like disloyalty either. And I think, anybody with half a brain can see that Robert Jenrick is propelled by his extremely ambitious wife. And he's only in it for himself. And it is absolutely beyond irony that these people stand up and talk about broken Britain without acknowledging that they had quite a large part in wielding the sodding sledgehammer. And I do think the other thing that I think about Kemi Badenoch, which is very interesting. Now, this may or may not have been coincident because it might have been scheduled anyway, but she did a big interview with one of the Sunday papers, and her tone is very much more optimistic about, yes, there are things that are broken and we must take responsibility for our part in that, but we can rebuild it. Now, that is a very stark contrast to the Reform slogan, which is Britain is broken, it's all to do with immigrants and we're going to rebuild it. And interestingly, there's been a few snap polls, and they are only snapshots. But what we've seen over the last few weeks is that Reform have slightly plateaued. I think we touched on this last week, Jim. But also the people who were the Tories who were attracted to Reform are now going back to the Conservative Party, which means that Reform is what? A rump of, as you say, failed Tory politicians. And it's not an attractive team of people. There's Nadeem Zahawi, who was Chancellor and, then had to resign because he was 5 million adrift in his income tax returns, and also claimed for heating his stables on his MP's expenses. So, the idea that people like that are in touch with the people who feel forgotten, left behind, and nobody's listened to them on genuine concerns, and that Robert Jenrick has got any interest in anybody other than himself, I think it makes Reform much less attractive.
Can we just have a word about this broken Britain thing? Because I slightly disagree. I mean, I would just be interested in what you think about this. It's this question of this balance between talking down the country and it not being an attractive message. And actually what Jenrick is saying, what Reform is saying, is that Britain is broken. I would just say that, in my opinion, people's experience when they can't get a train, they can't get a hospital appointment, they can't contact the Inland Revenue about their tax returns, which has been a bitter experience in my family recently, that actually people might lean more to Reform, saying they're right about that analysis, and this sort of soft peddling on how the state of the country by the Conservatives, maybe that's a plus for Reform.
I think that there's a debate to be had, but the problem is, Jim, when you start to pack your party with the people who've broken Britain, exactly, then it becomes a difficult argument to sell. And I think that if Labour has got anybody within its social media team that's decent to put in a reel together, and if they haven't, we've got people available that can help them downtown in business, then you would be putting together a collage of the people that have been recruited and their record in government. Exactly. And you will probably start with Jenrick and his very unfortunate predicament he got himself into when he was housing minister, of giving planning permission to somebody who'd given a very large donation to the Conservative Party. And you move on to the fact that he was the guy who had this bright idea of upping the number of hotel places that were available for immigrants. And then you might move on, as I say, to his bizarre statement, both at his press conference and then this morning. And then you move on to Nadeem Zahawi. I mean, I thought that was an even more bizarre recruitment from Farage, to be honest. And again, it comes down to the fact that he'd asked Badenoch to put him forward for a place in the Lords, and she turned him down. So all of this stuff is driven by self-interest. And as I say, I don't think it'd take too much of a communications genius to start to knit these things together and present the case that what we've got here is a broken Britain that's been broken by the people who are now fronting up reform. And what Labour are trying to do steadily, this will be Keir Starmer's message, of course, is try and repair that. I think from Badenoch's perspective, she's probably learned a thing or two from Labour, in that if you are too negative about Britain, if you're too negative about the country, then it does actually turn people off. And I think the other thing she's probably starting to believe is that she does have a chance of a route through to becoming Prime Minister. And therefore, if you've just talked the country down constantly for 3 years, and still a long way to go before the next general election, then it makes it hellishly difficult for you to stand on the steps of Downing Street and say, well, I know I said everything's shit, but we're going to sort it out. Yeah. So I don't know. I think, Jim, a more balanced and nuanced approach, which is what Badenoch seems to have adopted, might well bear fruit. My biggest thing about all of this is that you are starting to see, in my opinion, a group of middle-aged to elderly men start to try and create something that they're saying is anti-establishment and is new and different. And I think the Reform UK Party now, or business, or whatever it is these days, is starting to look anything other than that.
I think there is a sign that they are aware of that danger, because we should note that Farage has given a cut-off date of the day before the local elections to join the party.
Do you believe that, Jim?
Well, that's what I was going to raise. If another juicy, low-hanging fruit Tory former government failed government person offers themselves next summer, I take your point. But I just wondered whether, in recognition of his concern about this, they put that cut-off point in. But I mean, the only other thing to say, in fairness, is that there are one or two people, like Laura Cunningham, who's the Reform candidate for Mayor of London. She doesn't quite fall into that category, though she was a former Conservative. And also, Tice made the point yesterday, there's an awful lot of people being rejected for membership. To Tories or people we haven't heard of, councillors, that he says they're rejecting them because they don't think they fit. So just to put a bit of balance in, I imagine they're not taking in absolutely everybody, but of course we don't really hear about them because they're not making the headlines.
Well, they also say they're going to come out with a Labour defection this week, possibly Tuesday. Now, it would be interesting to see who that is, whether it's anybody we've ever heard of, care about, or indeed whether they've taken one look at the new Reform Party with their recruits and thought, actually, I think I'll stick with Labour or join the Greens. But I don't believe what Tice said, Jim, just judging by the number of councillors that seem beyond inept that are switching to Reform, unless they're saying, oh, I'm joining Reform, and they haven't as yet had their membership rejected.
It might be Kate Hoey, but she's actually an independent. My tip, and it's just Jimbo's just reaching for it, Lord Glassman, the leader of Blue Labour, who's who's very much on the right of the left. I mean, I've no foundation for saying that, and Frank's no doubt got impeccable contacts within the party.
He's very matey with Nigel Farage. That's not a bad tip, actually.
And Donald Trump.
But it would also give him someone in the Lords.
He got invited to his inauguration. I mean, for me, Glassman is, be good riddance if he went to Reform. And hardly again, people like we as political commentators know who Glassman is, but in terms of the general public, they'd be like, who the fuck's that fella? Well, but let's turn our attentions to Labour then, because the other thing, of course, that this then led to was apparently some unnamed sources within the cabinet suggesting that Keir Starmer needed to sharpen his elbows and he should put Wes Streeting back in his box and sack him from the cabinet. Now, I've heard many stupid, ridiculous and daft suggestions in my time in politics. I haven't heard many dafter than that. Here we have a health secretary who is arguably Labour's best media performer. He's somebody that people actually relate to and like when he is on television and radio interviews. You can tell that even the journalists warm to him. More importantly, of course, the health service is improving. And many of the things that Labour has committed to in terms of its health agenda are being delivered under the leadership of Wes Streeting. So I found it a somewhat bizarre suggestion, James. I don't think it's one that Keir Starmer is likely to take up, but I do think what it signals is that the internal wranglings within the Labour Party, behind the scenes at least, are still continuing. And I think it's inevitable when a Prime Minister is at north of minus 50% in terms of his own personal popularity ratings, that guess what? There will be people from across the political from the Labour Party who are thinking about what happens post-May. If he decided, Keir Starmer, to fall on his sword, as he almost did, let's not forget, after that Hartlepool by-election a number of years ago, do we really think that these ambitious politicians, all of whom, by the way, want to be Prime Minister, it's the fucking reason they go into Parliament and take all the shite that they take, do we really think that Wes Streeting is the only one who are thinking about, actually, should I be just making a plan or two as to whether or not a leadership campaign takes place? So, Jim, first of all, on the suggestion that Keir Starmer should sack Wes Streeting, do you think that's a likely scenario? And secondly, do you think I'm right? There'll be more than Wes Streeting thinking about the leadership contest, won't there?
Yes, indeed. I mean, this is the dilemma that Tony Blair had in 2001, because Gordon was already rumbling. And there's a new book coming out which gives even more fascinating information about that. This one, Brown is now explicitly saying that he should have, he promised him he'd go after 10 years as leader of the party in 2004. But anyway, that's by the way. But it was that dilemma. As you rightly say, you know, Wes Streeting is absolutely outstanding, the leading person in terms of delivery. You know, the waiting lists are coming down. He is beginning to deliver things. He seems to have seen off the resident doctors. He's an absolute star. He's a fantastic performer. You know, he delivers his messages effectively. I think he's very collegiate when he refers to his colleagues. I mean, there's been a lot of alleged irritation that Wes steps out of his lane and talks about other people's portfolios. But if he does that, he does it in a very collegiate way and praises all the people as he does it. But you're quite right that you know, there would be other contenders like Angela Rayner and Andy Burnham if he can tortuously get back to Westminster. But that said, it looks to me as if McSweeney is his main enemy in number 10. I mean, there was an interesting conference just after the New Year where Wes was speaking and he said, "I see the Chief of Staff is in the room. I better amend my speech." Funny joke, but I mean, it sort of identifies who he knows who's doing this briefing against him. And if he's got enemies like that around Starmer, he has got to be very careful. Because, you know, he has said a couple of things which I think are completely right, but he's just got to be careful. You know, we look a bit, I'm paraphrasing, but we look like a maintenance government rather than a government that's on the front foot. It would be handy if we get it right from the start. You know, phrases like that, which are very accurate commentaries on the government. But, you know, he just needs to be careful, you know, not to escalate it to the point where Wes's enemies do put pressure on the Prime Minister to commit what would be, as you rightly analysed, a very foolish act.
Well, if your prediction is true, and of course we don't know whether it will be, and they're usually not, and Lord Glassman decided to jump ship to reform, then that would be a major ally of Morgan McSweeney gone. And I think what they're trying to do from the Blue Labour side is line Shabana Mahmood up as the alternative to Keir Starmer. Then, as you say, Jim, You have a number of candidates on what would be described as the soft left, that would include Andy Burnham, of course, potentially Angela Rayner. Then another name that was thrown in the hat over the weekend, and another suspect as far as the anti-West Streeting briefings are concerned, is Darren Jones, who of course is Starmer's right-hand man now in number 10, but a man himself who will have potential leadership ambitions. And then if you move on through the party, you go to the hard left, they'd no doubt want to put a candidate up as well. And there's one or two other names that have been thrown in the hat. Jonathan Reynolds, Lisa Nandy. Would Yvette Cooper fancy being a caretaker? What about John Healey? I know you don't like Yvette Cooper, Jim. Don't know what she's done to you in a past life. But
I think she's very effective, that's all.
But I think she's one of those
staring through some binoculars in the snow in northern Norway last week. It didn't convince me. Don't think it convinced Mr. Putin either.
Yeah, it's a shame people don't look at what people are actually doing now.
Well, she's not doing anything.
But she did in the Home Office, James, and got no credit for it. So I don't necessarily think she would go for the leadership of the party. But what I'm saying is that there are a whole array of names of people who could potentially throw their hat in a ring for the leadership contest. But the one Keir Starmer's people seem to be concerned about is West Streeting. Because, as I say, it is for the birds to think that these other people, like Mahmood, like Burnham, fairly obviously, Angela Rayner, one or two others, are not at least partially thinking about what happens next. If Keir falls on his sword, what do I do? So the fact that West Streeting is the one that they're targeting would suggest to me that he's the guy that they're most concerned about because he's the most effective.
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Frank. And, you know, all of those people that you've mentioned, they're all really good communicators. They have a connection. They speak human. And whether you like them or not, or like their policies or not, you actually know where you are. You know, Andy Burnham is a great communicator. Angela Rayner is as well. And Wes Streeting, as we've said, is also. So, you know, if you've got somebody running the number 10 operation, Morgan McSweeney, and his lieutenant, who is so pissed off every time Wes Streeting does a good interview, manages to stick on message, big up the health service, deal with the crisis and answer questions fairly straightforwardly, then you've got a bigger problem. What you need to do is sort your communications out. And I would just say that, you know, actually, I slightly agree with what you both said about he needs to just be, because he's such a good communicator, it's almost instinctive, but he just needs to be a little bit mindful about not looking as though he's attacking the Prime Minister, because you need to have ownership of it. And you can say, we should be getting it right first time, not that sort of implicit they or he. And you just need to change your language just very slightly so that you are taking a collective responsibility. And the other thing I would say, and I know we're moving on to this in the second half, but actually for everything that apparently is going wrong at home, and as we've spoken many times, it's about the communications, not so much the things that are going wrong. What Keir Starmer's trying to do on the world stage is something that nobody could have predicted pre-July 2024, and he's having to battle with it. And every time he thinks, right, I'm going to focus on, you know, whatever it is, you know, employment or the health service or education or whatever, you know, there's some other bogey that comes out of America or Russia or Ukraine or Greenland or somewhere else, and he's doing a really good job. And I think, you know, we are in that world of rather stupid, rather narrow media focus on, oh, nothing works, everything's broken, it's horrible, without stopping and thinking, actually, do you know what? I did get an appointment at the doctor's. I did manage to get the cat to the vet. I have got water, which in Kent, frankly, is a miracle these days, but we do still have a hosepipe ban. And, you know, nobody's doing the good stuff. And that's what we need a little bit more of. And I agree with what you said earlier about, you know, you need to have nuance. But, you know, you can't say everything's broken without saying either your part in breaking it or how you plan to fix it. And I would just say that actually, if we were a little bit more grown up and we looked above the horizon, and I do take the media to task on this particularly, and we saw the real challenges around the world, I think Keir Starmer would get a better ride.
Well, I think that the geopolitical turbulence that we are experiencing actually might save Keir Starmer's leadership,
exactly.
because we've often said that on the international stage he's done a good job. I think he'd be a fabulous foreign secretary, and I think he'd be a good diplomat, whether that makes him a good prime minister or not. But of course, when you are in times of trouble with your international, well, in this case, allies, then the prime minister all of a sudden, and the way in which he handles those situations, are important. And I think people start to think about these things, don't they, when they're talking about changing prime ministers? And would people see Keir Starmer as a safer pair of hands in comparison to Nigel Farage, Kemi Badenoch, or indeed Andy Burnham and Wes Streeting? Jim, that could be something that comes to rescue Starmer, couldn't it?
It could indeed. I was just reminding myself of Arthur Balfour, who, of course, was Prime Minister early in the 20th century and then came back as Foreign Secretary, and, of course, was author of the Balfour Declaration, which, of course, continues to be a highly significant document. So, you know, it's an idea for the future. And, of course, Lord Hume of the Hersal, Prime Minister 63-4, came back as Foreign Secretary. So there are precedents for that.
And David Cameron in most of our lifetime.
Yes, of course. Cameron came back as Foreign Secretary, didn't he, after quite a time away? Okay, well, listen, I think we've done that to death as far as the domestic political scene is concerned. I actually think that one final point on the Labour Party internal wranglings, the fact that there is an array of candidates helps Keir Starmer as well. If there was so you mentioned earlier Tony Blair's challenge with Gordon Brown, but it was just with Gordon Brown, Jim. You know, very few other candidates were seriously mentioned. I know that David Miliband had a little nibble at one point, and there were one or two others on the periphery, but it was always going to be Gordon. Whereas with this Parliamentary Labour Party, I don't sense that they've got a fucking clue about many things in terms of picking somebody, something, a policy. I mean, they're all over the place. So if I was any of those potential leadership candidates, I would be concerned about going too soon, because actually, have they got the 80 MPs? And then, of course, you've got to negotiate the membership, and you could end up with a field of bloody thousands.
Yeah, but 80, that's the point. 80 MPs, 80 Labour MPs have got to stand up and challenge Keir Starmer, who said that he's going to be on the ballot paper. I mean, whether he actually would be, if he wasn't, then there's a different ball game. But if Starmer says, I'm going to fight this leadership election, so 80 Labour MPs have to support, as you say, one particular candidate, when, as you've illustrated, there's a menu of choice.
Yeah. And the other problem that people like Wes and Andy have got is that people are starting to say it's got to be a female. Now, it's not necessarily something I would subscribe to, but there is going to be some pressure from the likes of trade unions and other organisations that are affiliated to the Labour Party to say, the Tories have had 3 female leaders now, is it? Can we count Liz Truss?
Well, yeah.
4, okay. And, you know, we've still, in the Labour Party, not. So that's another thing to throw into the mix. But listen, I'm sure the conversation will come back to in future weeks. But in the second part of today's Downtown Den Politics podcast, we will be turning our attention to international affairs and the latest on Greenland. That's a sentence I never thought I would say in my life. But there you go, guys. Politics is full of surprises. Stay with us. We'll be back in a moment. Welcome back to the second part of this week's Downtown Den Politics podcast, where you've got 3 presenters this week, me, Frank McKenna, Jim Hancock and Joe Phillips, all celebrating, this is an unusual occurrence, victories for our football teams over the weekend. Everton overcame Aston Villa, West Ham beat Tottenham Hotspur, Not too difficult these days, I have to say. Who did Plymouth beat, James?
We beat the Posh. We beat Peterborough United,
Wow.
extending our unbeaten away run. And Tom Cleverley is almost as high in my estimation as James Cleverley.
There you go. So a good weekend
Not quite.
a good weekend was had by all. So there you go, on the football front at least. Not so much a great weekend if you are a European leader or a member of NATO or indeed Keir Starmer, because Donald Trump has decided that his threat against Greenland to be stepped up. He's, of course, been on a number of foreign excursions in recent weeks. The snatching of the Prime Minister of Venezuela. It started with that, really, didn't it? And then he started to turn his attention to Greenland. And of course, whilst all this is going on, nobody's talking about the Epstein files, which may or may not be anything to do with what he and his acolytes are up to. But he's written a letter to the Prime Minister of Norway this morning, as Mr. Trump, President Trump, who and basically outlined that the main reason that he wants to take Greenland is because Norway didn't give him the Nobel Peace Prize, and he stopped 8 wars. What more do I have to do? So maybe I should speak less about peace and start talking more about war. And if I have to go to war with people who've been our allies for nearly 100 years more, then that's what I'll have to do. It's an absolutely incredible and bizarre situation, Jim. I can't quite get my head around where the Americans are coming from this strategically. So let's try and be serious about the issue for one moment, because of course, let's remind ourselves that the Americans have got carte blanche in that part of the world militarily. He can put as many troops in Greenland as he wishes. But what American presidents, including Trump, have done consecutively in recent times is withdrawn troops from that part of the world. And of course, when that happens, then your real enemies, in this instance China and Russia, start to see that there's been a dilution of American activity, and lo and behold, they start to have a little nibble at that part of the world as well. And of course, the big reason why this is all of a sudden becoming an issue and a strategic potential battleground is because of this thing that Donald Trump denies happening, global warming. So there's a whole array of things here that I'm scratching my head thinking, why would the Americans even consider this to be a serious proposition? And it comes down to me, Jim, to 2 things. One, to give Trump some benefit of the doubt would be to say he's desperate for some legacy, and therefore, if he can say, look at this big, massive land that I was able to deliver and extend America's range of territory, that would be the kind. It's still not right, of course, but that would at least explain some of what he's up to. But I do think there's a political situation occurring here. MAGA was really starting to split. You could see some of the bigger names, Marjorie Taylor Greene amongst them, of course, getting really irritable and pissed off over the lack of action over the Epstein files. And nobody's talked about them because he's on his foreign excursions.
I think those 2 things are absolutely right. But I think the key thing here is the minerals under the ice.
Okay.
That's what he's after. He's after the oil of Venezuela. He pays attention to the Middle East because of the oil. This man, and he wants to settle with Russia because he sees all the unexplored business opportunities. This is what it's principally about, because you're quite right. Either the United States could reoccupy the 12 bases that they used to have in Greenland and put as many troops as they wanted, or, which I think would be a much healthier option, and what I hope is going to be the focus of talks this week in Davos and elsewhere, that we could start to step up to the plate, because as Joe and I were saying last week, if Trump has a point, it is that we have piggybacked on the United States for too long, and Europe's got to wake up with all the financial implications for welfare in this country and step up our military efforts to support the United States. So my solution to this would be to have, revamp the American bases, but with the presence of non-United States troops there as well. And that's if Trump is really concerned about the security situation, that would sort that out without any of this ridiculous tension. But if it's for the minerals, and he could only get that by getting Greenland as part of the United States, then we've got to try and face him down. But then, of course, we come to the tricky thing. I say that, but it's not beyond the realms of possibility that if we really up the ante, and there's no sign of that happening from Starmer's statement on Monday, which was largely a reiteration of let's cool it, but without any sort of roadmap to how that's to be done. This is why I've got sympathy for Starmer and others. If we overdo the rhetoric after this highly offensive ultimatum that Trump has done, then it's possible that he will pull out of the Ukraine negotiations, and that would be very, very serious indeed.
I think that the reaction of the European Union, Keir Starmer, and NATO is crucially important, though, because how far do you allow Donald Trump to continue this bullying approach that he's taken since he took over the White House 18 months ago? And I don't think that these deals that he's done with us, or anyone else for that matter, are worth the paper they're written on. He's proved that overnight by saying, well, I'm just going to slap tariffs on you then. At what point do you say this guy's just not somebody you can trust? And therefore, as you rightly say, Jim, they need to step up and step up quick. And arguably they should have been doing this a number of years ago, but we are where we are. And so for me, they've got to start to be more robust in terms of their response to some of this nonsense that Trump and his administration are coming out with. And interesting, Joe, that Mark Carney spent a couple of days in China and has started to talk about deals with the Chinese, and said very clearly, when you have trusted allies historically who are clearly not to be trusted anymore, then you've got to start to be more pragmatic in your approach to the strategic relationships that you develop. And I'm very aware of the fact that the American Speaker of the House is in the UK today, criticising, cheeky bugger, our approach to planning permission for new Chinese embassy in London, saying that this would be a terrible threat to the West. Well, my riposte to him will be, well, what you're doing, mate, is far worse than us giving planning permission for a Chinese embassy. But I wonder whether, because Starmer's due to go to China soon, behind the scenes at least, Whitehall officials and the government are thinking, we're going to have to become a little bit smarter in terms of our relationship with the Chinese. The other thing I think it does, Joe, is this whole situation, is it moves the dial once again on the whole debate about our links with the European Union. And many people who voted to leave the EU for reasons other than let's kick as many black people out of the country as we can, will have their head in their hands thinking, how isolated does the UK look now without that link to Europe?
Well, absolutely. And I think, the one very tiny silver lining of all of this nonsense caused by Trump is the fact that Europe is, there are differences of opinion, but broadly speaking, united, and that includes the UK, and obviously includes Canada as well, as this sort of coalition of the willing. And I think, as we said in the first half, a lot of that is down to Keir Starmer's temperament, his calmness, his diplomacy, and all of those good qualities that he's brought to bear on the world stage. And I think, that we have got to be really clear that we are probably facing a choice, although it's not one that anybody would want to make, between America and Europe. And it's very clear that our future and our security lies with Europe for geographic as well as economic and other reasons. And I think, the point about whether you can trust America is a really, really, really big issue. And there are questions, and they've been raised by people in the security service, should America anymore be allowed to be part of Five Eyes, which is the, real-time live information that is shared across the security services. And I think the problem with Trump is it doesn't matter how much you fawn, how many state visits you offer him, how many papier-mâché FIFA peace prizes and all the rest of it you give him. He's like a child and he just wants something else. And as you said at the outset, Frank, America has got a military base in Greenland. They can ramp it up, they can build more, they can put more stuff there, they can put more kit, they can put more soldiers there. They don't need to own it. And this, I think, is where everything is really so topsy-turvy, that Trump's understanding of the world is I want to own it, not I want it for strategic purposes or military purposes. And we should also say, and I agree with you both about, it's a fantastic sideshow to detract from Epstein. 16,500 people have been killed in Iran. Trump said he was going to help. Help is coming. What happened? He's looked the other way. What's happening in Gaza? What's happening in Ukraine? And of course, what happens with Greenland and the relationship between NATO and Europe will have huge implications for Ukraine. And I think that's why, Europe is treading carefully, even though through gritted teeth and pinched noses, towards some sort of diplomatic deal with Trump. Because if he pulls out of supporting Ukraine, then Europe is very, very much at risk. But I think we're living in very, very dangerous times.
I'm not sure that the support for Ukraine has ever been as certain or consistent. And you mentioned Gaza there, Joe. Breaking news, and this is as we record the podcast today, is that Vladimir Putin has received an invitation to join the US-led Peace Council for Gaza.
God's sake.
Now, if that's the case, and I should just caveat this by saying, statement from the Kremlin, but I doubt whether that statement would have been made from the Kremlin if it not true. And therefore, you start to ask yourself how serious Trump is about supporting Ukraine anyway. And then when you listen to military personnel from the Brits and others, they've said that actually it's since the French went in with their intelligence services that Ukraine have been able to start to push back a little in terms of recent successes that the Russian military had enjoyed in Ukraine. So I don't think Trump is to be trusted.
No,
I wonder whether economically we do need to be more aggressive now. It causes so much turmoil and turbulence. But this is an administration, Jim, I would suggest, that is as equally dangerous as China. And therefore, why wouldn't you go and have a conversation with the Chinese?
Well, you've put a thought in my head. You pointed out these talks between Canada and China, and you just put a thought in my. I'll just leave it hanging out there. A new world order: China, Canada, and Europe versus the United States and Russia.
Wow.
I mean, it's mind blowing, and I don't suppose it'll happen. But this news about Putin. And it's all of a piece that Trump is determined to appease him. But anyway, just going back to the Greenland thing for a moment, a very significant day tomorrow is the Supreme Court are due to rule on the legality of the whole tariff strategy. Now, the Supreme Court has been fairly supine in supporting Trump, and I find it mind-blowing to think that they're going to blow his whole tariff strategy out of the water, though of course, as Joe said before we started recording, he could ignore it. But nevertheless, if the Supreme Court was to say that you can't the president doesn't have the power to manipulate tariffs like this. That would sort of slightly undermine the Greenland strategy. There is evidence of some growing Republican concern behind the scenes, and inevitably Trump is beginning to lose some influence. And that's my last point on this, is that this ultimatum of February the 1st and then a ratcheting up of sanctions again to 25% in April, it smacks of a man who's beginning to see that he could well lose the midterm elections, lose the House of Representatives, and then he does go into a lame duck situation. Now, he will probably rail against it and behave even worse rather than just fading away. But I think those are the things we've got to think about. And the last point I'll make, as I've made in my blog, is that absolutely, we should never have left the European Union, but we need to get inside the European Union again. And controversially, I believe there should now, as against this before, there should be a EU army. We should make all our military equipment similar, because apparently, Danish guns don't fit into British and all that nonsense. We've got to do that. And because, you've got this world situation where you've got these empires now, China, Russia, the United States, and then hang on a minute, 370 million people in a, pretty prosperous part of the world. It's the hole in the middle of the polo mint. Europe, when we're massively underplaying what our potential influence could be.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things I'd say in terms of the domestic situation in America. I've got no faith in the Supreme Court, and I've less faith in Trump taking any notice of them.
Well,
we seem to
exactly.
have an administration in place that totally ignores the rule of law, as can be seen at the activities of ICE, which has been absolutely appalling. Never thought I would see the day when you had American thugs on the street shooting innocent women 3 times in the head at point blank range, and the government's actually defending it. It's absolutely disgraceful what's happening in the state. In terms of the midterm elections, Jim, let's see if they happen. And if they do happen, how much intimidation is going to be taking place at those polling booths in places where it's considered to be a tight race between the Republicans and the Democrat Party? And if you were black or Hispanic, would you be going to the polls and risking getting lifted by ICE during an election campaign? So that's an issue as well. And the final point I'll make as far as Europe is concerned, I absolutely agree with you in terms of becoming more united, more coherent, and having a more coordinated approach to defence and a whole lot of other issues as well. Good to see Giorgia Meloni as being one of the people, the Italian Prime Minister, come out and say that she's totally against what Trump's doing as far as Greenland's concerned. But equally, there is a fragmentation across Europe as well. And whereas 5, 6, 7 years ago, you could see the sense of having a more united, coherent approach to defence, would you trust Le Pen in France, for example, as an ally to sit alongside you? So it's difficult, it's complex, it's complicated. But I think on the trade side of things, at least, Keir Starmer is absolutely right, as is Mark Carney, to be saying to the Chinese, let's have a look and see what we can do, because you've got to somehow, some way, begin to push back in a practical sense against Trump's bullying, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, really get moving quickly on this. I mean, you mentioned the breaking news about Putin or Russia being invited to join this board. The draft charter for the board now shows that it seeks to act beyond its Gaza mandate and become a global governing group, allowing it to rival the UN. But in order to join the board, you've got to pay £1 billion up front, which will be controlled by Trump, and you can only serve for 3 years. So, this is, again, it's the grotesqueness of him buying or setting up something which is completely opposite to what the United Nations, however toothless and useless it is, it's not there for people to feather their own nest. This is about divvying up the world. If you can pay to be part of this conglomerate, you can have a bit of Gaza, you can have a bit of Ukraine, you can have the minerals in Africa, and you can have what's under the ground in Greenland when the seas melt. It is absolutely grotesque, and I think we need to be talking to everybody and anybody and really looking to shore up our relationships, whether that's on trade or security or economics, because we cannot trust Donald Trump.
It's frightening. And when you put it into the framework that you've just described, Joe, trying to set up an alternative UN, but give me £1 billion for me to put in my bank account to control before you can sit on the board. I'll tell you, the other guy who's going to feel a little bit of heat now, because apparently he's been invited to serve on this board, and that's our former Prime Minister, Tony Blair. I wonder what he's thinking about all of this, and whether he's thinking that that invitation actually might be one that he wouldn't necessarily welcome.
Where are the Palestinian representatives?
They're not. They haven't been invited. They haven't got enough money.
Well, they haven't got £1 billion, have they? Well, they probably have,
Gaza,
actually, but yeah.
But Gaza's not even mentioned in the draft agreement.
It's, as I say, it's absolutely frightening to think where we are geopolitically. And people said Trump getting into the White House wouldn't make that much difference. I think what we underestimated, or what some people underestimated, not me, listen to our podcast, Moving Back in Time, was that the people around Trump this time round, far more dangerous, far more, I use this word advisedly, evil than the people he had around him the first time, who were basically traditional political advisors, political players who've been around the block and did at least see the value of the Western alliance.
I think that's very important in terms of us focusing too much on once Donald Trump is gone, everything will return to normal. I think, Frank, you've got a very good point there. There are now people embedded in the American establishment, both mentally and physically in office, that want to continue this project, and stopping it and making a real U-turn. What effect it will have on the Democrats? We're coming into, if they came into office, how much would they resile on it? This is like a permanent presence in American politics. I think you're very right to say it's not just a one-man band. There is a force of people around him.
No, I think Trump is, the cheerleader in chief, obviously, and still has, a bizarre following of people. He is a bit of a cult figure, isn't he? Is Trump. So I think the danger for the Republicans is that when he does fall off his perch, and that could be sooner rather than later, he's not looking well, and he's becoming even more bizarre in terms of some as pronounced. Did you see him flicking the bird to that Ford worker last week who called him a paedophile protector? I mean, talk about undermining the office of president. But so he's becoming more bizarre in his behaviour. As I say, I think the danger for the Republicans is whether or not you will get the following and the support that they've had under Trump's leadership with, let's say, J.D. Vance, who's an even more dangerous personality than Trump, in my view. But we'll see. And as I say, there's real threats to democracy in the States. And I know that people don't like using the F word, as in fascism, but we are seeing an awful lot of things happening in the States at the moment that Nazi Germany actually gave the playbook to. It's frightening, as I say. There's no other word for it. Let's try and cheer people up before we go with something lighter. I'm not sure what this is going to be, but I'm hoping Jim or Joe can help me out. Is there anything that we can leave our listeners with on this bluest of Blue Mondays, because of course today is Blue Monday, that we can say, go away and think about this instead?
Yeah, the days are getting longer. The hours of daylight are getting noticeably longer. The bulbs are beginning to poke through the wet and frozen gardens, and spring is on its way. But I think, my message is, for God's sake, don't put your head in your sand or the sand. Get out, get voting, get involved, for whichever party you support or none. We need to take part in democracy to protect it.
Okay. There's some bulbs poking through. There you go.
Snowdrops. I've got to see a notice in planting.
Are they your own bulbs poking through there, Jim?
They are, Frank. The way you phrase that is leading us down a path which I think we won't go.
There you go. Well, there you go. We've ended on a lighter note with Jim showing us his bulbs poking through. If you're not watching on
Careful.
YouTube, then I'm sure that's going to incentivize you to do so. This has been great to have your company, guys, as I say, on this Blue Monday. I know it's been a very heavy session as that one, but there's a lot of serious things happening across the globe at the moment, and not many of them good. Hopefully this time next week, Trump and Dharma have got together in Davos and sorted out a much better deal than the one that looks as though it's emerging for Greenland and indeed Gaza. We'll be back next week to talk about it all and more besides, I'm sure. Thanks for joining us. Have a great week, everyone.